Okay, good evening, everyone. We are going to do a longer Star Wars reading tonight because I got myself kind of screwed up. Um, I did not realize that the last chapter of The Lost Tribe of the Sith Precipice is only 3 pages. So, not enough to do a session, obviously. I know I'm a slow reader, but not that slow. Um, So we're going to jump straight into the second book in the series of The Lost Tribe of the Sith, which is Skyborn. And we'll do at least the first 2 chapters, and we'll see where we are at that point. So, um, with that, I'm going to jump into this last chapter of The Lost Tribe of the Sith Precipice. It was nearly night when Corson appeared on the twice-trodden trail, pulling a makeshift sledge crafted from a mess table, with thermal blankets and the remaining food packs heaped upon it. Corson had needed the help of the Force a few times to get it down the mountain. Straps from pouches cut into his shoulders and neck, leaving ugly welts. The single campfire had become several. He was glad to see them. Ravelin appeared glad to see him too, after an initial surprised reaction. "The beacon! Is it working?" "I pushed the button myself," Corson announced. "And?" "And we wait." Ravelin's eyes narrowed in the smoky haze. "You know where we are. You spoke to someone?" Corson's attention had already turned to unloading the packs to anxious crew members. Ravelin lowered his voice. "Where are your Masasi?" Corson didn't look up. "All dead. You don't think I wanted to do this myself, do you?" The quartermaster's crimson face paled a little. "No, of course not, Commander." He looked back at the summit, fading in the surrounding darkness. "Perhaps others of us could have a look at the transmitter. We might—" "Ravelin, if you want to go back up there, you're welcome to it. But I'd bring a team with some heavy equipment, because if we don't get some supports under the ship, the next person who boards could take it on its last flight." Corson set down the last pack and stretched his neck. "Where are your Masasi?" Ravelin stared. "All dead." Corson stepped free, at last, from the cabling he'd used to drag the sledge. The bonfire blazed invitingly. So why was he so cold? "Sela. Where's Devore?" He looked at her coldly. Sela stood, her tarnished gold uniform flickering in the firelight. "Where is Devore?" he repeated. "He went up." She stopped herself. No one was supposed to leave camp, and now the look in Yaru Corson's eyes. She squeezed Jared, who woke crying. The pep talk began, as many of Corson's did, with a summation of things everyone already knows. But this speech was different because there were so many things nobody knew, himself included. The assurance that Nagasedo still valued their cargo rang true for all, and while they were clearly a long way from anywhere, few could imagine the Sith Lord's desire exceeding his reach. Even if they were less sanguine about what Sato felt about them, Corson knew his crew would accept that someone somewhere was looking for them. They just didn't need to know how long that might take. It was too soon for that. Sato, he would figure out later. This place couldn't be about what was next. It had to be about now. By the speech's end, Corson found himself growing unusually philosophical. It was our destiny to land on this rock, and we are bound to our destiny. For a time it looks like we're also bound to this rock, he said. So be it. We're Sith. Let's make it ours. He looked toward a satellite campfire and spotted Gloyd and the remains of his gunnery crew bristling against the breeze. He waved them to the main bonfire. It would be another hard night, Corson knew, and the supplies he brought would soon run out. But he knew something else, something he'd seen that no one else had. The winged beast had carried a rider. The Force was with them. Gripping her son, Sela watched the circle break. Nodding, humans, Sith set to their tasks. Stepping around Ravelin, the master without Massassi, he stood aloof, commensurate with the Red Sith and the few other surviving aliens. Energized and triumphant, Yaru Corson conferred with Gloyd, keeping his confidences, as he always had, to the huge alien. Too strong to be defeated, too stupid to betray him, and dumb to the Force. The perfect ally. Turning away from the hook, Corson saw Sela, a new land to be broken to his will, and no one to stand in his way. He smiled. Sela returned his gaze coldly, thinking of Devore, thinking of little Jared. She made a quick decision. Summoning all her anger, all her hatred, all her will, Sela smiled back. Devore had underestimated Yaru Corson. Whatever came, Sela thought, she would not. She would bide her time. Time they had. And that's that. That's the whole end of the chapter, which I did not realize, because there are a bunch of excerpts from other books at the end of this that makes it look like there's more book left than there is. So anyway, that is all of that for Precipice. So I am going to go ahead and jump into the next book, which is Skyborn. And let's see what happens here. Okay, that's not going to work. Bear with me a minute. Okay, Skyborn. Okay, so chapter 1. And this, I read ahead just a little bit, and it seems like it jumps a bit, but it still says it's 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. Heretic! Good to see you too, Mother, Adari said. Did the children behave? The door hadn't fully closed when the smaller child was in Adari's arms, shoved there by Yulin. Adari's older boy bounded into the room, hobbling her. Under attack from 4 purple arms, Adari staggered toward the wall, looking for a spot to drop her non-living cargo. The canvas bag thudded against the wooden floor. Heretic! That's what your uncle says they're calling you, Yulin said. He was here, and neighbor Wertram, the tailor, and his wife, too. She never leaves the hut for anything. 8 people have been by today. Well, don't look outside, Adari said. More followed me home. She shooed the gangly older child away and tried to rescue her silvery hair from her toddler's mouth. Short hair wasn't the fashion for Kashiri women, but for Adari it was self-defense. Where her youngest was concerned, it'd never be short enough. Is the stew on? Stew? Yulin yanked her little grandson back, only to see Adari dart into the kitchen. Flushed with aggravation, Yulin's skin took on a violet hue that almost matched her daughter's. "You're worried about dinner? You don't have any idea what's been going on around here, do you?" "It's a dinner break. I was working." "Working nothing. I know where you were." Adari stared into the clay crock full of boiling meat and vegetables and sighed. Of course her mother knew where she'd been. Everyone did. Adari Val, collector of rocks and stones, young widow of the valiant Uvok rider on whom so many hopes had rested. Adari Val, enemy of right and order, absent mother and misleader of other people's children. Today had been her third day of testimony before the Neshtavar. It had gone as well as the other two. "What is that sound?" "They're hitting the house with rocks," Adari said, returning with a steaming bowl that she set on the table. Standing back, she swung the front door wide and watched as several gifts from the community bounced over the threshold. She slammed the door quickly. A peppery stone under the empty creche drew her eye. She reached for it with a sinewy, stretched arm. "This is a nice one," she said. "Not from around here." She was apparently drawing people from all over. She'd she'd have she'd have to look around later. Who needed expeditions when you had an angry mob to collect samples? Adari knelt and put the discovery in her pouch, already overflowing with stones of every shape and color. Above, the clatter grew louder. The younger child wailed. Yulin's huge dark eyes widened further with horror. "Adari, listen," she said. "They're hitting the roof now." "That's actually thunder." "It's proof that's what it is. The Skyborn have forsaken you." "No, Mother, it's proof that they're protecting me," Adari said, eating standing up. "If it rains, the mob can't set our house on fire." That wasn't likely to happen. The widow of the Neshtavari was a protected person, unlikely to be killed in a riot. However, there was nothing wrong with making her life miserable, and since her sin was against the Neshtavar themselves, no authority would stop them. In fact, little displays like this were good for public order. Apparently, we've jumped quite a ways, or we're not on the same world. I don't know what's going on. Adari poked her head into the backyard. No rocks there, just the Uvok, doing what he had done all year, taking up most of the place and being unfragrant. Emerald reptilian eyes opened long enough to shoot her a bad look. His leathery wings shifted, raking against the sides of the pen. The beast didn't mind the cooling rain, but the noise from the street had disturbed his royal slumber. Riderless Uvok were all sloth and bad habit, but Nink hadn't liked his rider when he had one. He was Adari's least favorite thing, but he came with the house. In a sense, the house was his. In olden times, when a Neshtavari, an Uvok rider, died, the community had slain the deceased's family as well. That practice had ended, perhaps the only time the Neshtavar had allowed practicality to overrule tradition. Uvok were precious, temperamental, and attached to their riders. Stabling them with the dead rider's survivors often kept the beasts sane enough to be useful for the breeding market. Not to mention, Adari mused, what it must have done for Neshtavar breeding. The riders hadn't had great social lives when death was in the picture, but since the change, Uvok riders had become highly sought after as mates in Kashiri society. Oh, maybe these are the natives that were the riders. Okay. Adari hadn't sought Jari Val at all. She was interested in rocks. Jari was their equal for conversational ability. In 9 years, he had given her two dim-witted children, a description that seemed less harsh to her than maternally charitable. She loved them well enough, but they were showing no signs of being any kinder or brighter than their father had been. Foolishness bred true. She, the fool for not running away, well, he was Jarival, the valiant young rider of the Neshtavar, on whom so many hopes rested. That was the line from the wake. Had mistreated Nink one too many times. One beautiful morning, the beast had flown Jari far out over the sea and unceremoniously dropped him. Adari was sure she had seen a hint of satisfaction in the creature's bright green eyes when he returned home. She'd never gotten along with Nink before, but at least now she paid him some respect. When it came to Jari, the Uvok had had more sense than she did. It wasn't all her fault, she knew. The match had resulted from years of lobbying by Yulin seeking to lock in her family's future position. Only males became riders, but Kashiri property descended matrilineally. Now Adari and her mother had the Uvok and the wooden house, while their neighbors lived in huts of lashed-together Hajarbo shoots. Yulin was thrilled, and Adari was content to let the children be Yulin's domain too. Adari had done her duty. The Kashiri had been advanced by another generation. Now she could concentrate on something important, if they'd let her. I have to go back, she said, lifting her younger son from his work destroying the dinner table. The afternoon hearing had gone long, and an unprecedented evening session loomed. I knew you'd do something like this, Yulin said, her gaze piercing her daughter's back. I've always said all that digging around in the filth would do you no good, and arguing with the Neshtavar? Why do you always have to be right? I don't know, Mother, but it's something I'm going to have to live with, Adari said, handing off the dripping toddler. A smeary imprint remained on her tunic. No time for a change. Try to get Tona and Finn to actually sleep tonight. I'll be back. She opened the door carefully to find that the rain had driven off the crowd. Comfort trumped belief on Kesh. But the rocks remained, dozens of iconic little statements scattered all across the stoop. If the hearings lasted any longer, she wouldn't have to do any more field research for the season. Everything she needed would be on her doorstep. Perhaps she should offend the Skyborn every year. We were talking about the Flamestones, Adari reminded the chief of the Nestavar. You were talking, Isri Daj said. I accept no such term. The aged rider and high counselor hobbled around the edge of the Circle Eternal, a plaza where a tall column served as a massive sundial. Adari looked around, another gorgeous evening for a place that had no other kind. It was the same every day. Inland, a brief, determined afternoon rain followed by a cool breeze that blew straight through the night. But now half the village had forgone real entertainments to watch a bald, bloodless man harangue a young woman. There are no Flamestones, he said, gesturing to a pair of crimson rocks on a pedestal beside the central column. I see here only normal stones of Kesh, as you might find on any hillside. Adari coughed. You have something to say? I'd better not. Adari looked up from her seat in the sandy clearing and then around at the glaring listeners. What was the point? No one would listen. Why keep making it worse? She took another look at Isri. This lavender wraith was the man who had eulogized Jari. What did he know about anything? What business did the Neshtavar have telling anyone what to think, just for convincing a few lazy animals to take them for rides now and again? Fine, she thought, rising. These'll be 2 fewer rocks they can throw. She took a stone from the pedestal. The scholars of Kesh have collected stones from every part of this continent. We record what we find. We compare. This rock came from the foot of the Cecil Spire on the southern coast. The crowd murmured. Everyone knew the smoking spire, rumbling and bubbling at the edge of civilization. Someone must have been crazy to go out there collecting rocks. The spire created this stone from the flames it holds inside, and this, Adari said, picking up the other rock, was found right here outside the village, buried in the riverbed. The stones were identical. Now the mountains ringing our plateau aren't smokers, what we call volcanoes. At least not now, but this rock being here suggests they might once have been. This whole continent, in fact, might have been created by them. Heretic! Is my mother here? Adari craned her neck, scanning the crowd. Someone tittered. Isri took the stones from her and rustled along the perimeter of the audience. You say these stones came from below? He said the horrible word dripping from his tongue. And created all this, all that is Kesh? Then and now, the smokers are building more land all the time. But you know that all that is Kesh came from the Skyborn, Isri said, jabbing his cane in her direction. Nothing can be born of Kesh anew. She knew, every child knew. The Skyborn were the great beings above, the closest thing the Kesh had to deities. Well, there was something else, something closer. The Neshtavar, as the self-proclaimed sons of the Skyborn, might as well have been the Skyborn as far as life on Kesh was concerned. Kashiri faith was vertical. High was mighty. The elevated were venerated. It was Erie's Uvok riding group that ages before had brought down from the lofty oceanside peaks the wisdom of the great battle of creation. Riding colossal Uvok of crystal, the Skyborn had fought the other side in the stars. The battle raged for eons, with the other side injuring the Skyborn before being defeated. Drops of Skyborn blood fell upon the roiling black seas, forming the land that birthed the Kashiri people. Adari wondered about the biology of a gigantic sandy-blooded race, but the Neshtavar notion had something going for it. The Kashiri's few maps of the land looked as if one of her kids had spilled something on them. Long-ridged peninsulas spattered in all directions from a cluster of plateaus, forming enormous, often unwalkable coastlines and fjords. Enough for the Kashiri to harvest marine life forever. Farther up the many rivers to the plateaus, farmers drew even more from the rich soil. The Kashiri numbers were both vast and well-fed. About the other side, Adari found the Neshtavar were incurious to a fault. That which opposed the Skyborn meant death, sickness, fire, rebellion, in no particular order. When it wasn't taking mortal form in accordance with the storyteller's needs, the other side came from below, another element in the message of vertical faith, and that was all there was to say. Given the elders' devotion to the Skyborn, Adari was surprised they hadn't hammered down who or what the other side was, but then, if they had, they'd have come up with a better name. Which wasn't stopping Isri from invoking it repeatedly as he railed at her. Your words glorify the other side, Adari Val. It's why you are here. You are here for preaching, teaching, telling these lies about the great battle to your acolytes. Acolytes? They're students. She searched the crowd for familiar faces. Her students had ducked out the day before when things had gotten rough, but some of their parents were here. You, Origaran, you sent your son to the scholars because he wasn't any good at the mill. And Wertram, your daughter, everyone here in Tav, do you think the village is going to fall into a hole because I talked to your children about some rocks? It very well could. Isri grabbed his cane from its spot by the pedestal and shook it. This land was a part of the living Skyborn. Do you think they do not hear you? When the ground quakes, when the smokers burn, it's their remnant acting in sympathy with their wishes. Their wishes that we honor them and hate the other side. This again. I know that's what you think, Adari said, searching for slow, even tones. I don't pretend to know what forces work the world. That's clear. But if disagreeable words caused the world to shake, Kesh would rock every time husbands and wives quarreled. She inhaled deeply. Surely the Skyborn have more important affairs than to police our own little disagreements. I know they do. Silence. Adari looked around. Dark Kashiri eyes, once aimed at her, pointed down and away. She'd won a few that time. Maybe not enough to let her keep her job, but enough that she could keep collecting. Crack-a-boom! Purple faces turned west, toward the Katajan Mountains, jutting out into the ocean. Beyond the range provided the village of Tav some of its finest sunsets. But now the flames were coming from the mountain peak itself. A pillar of fiery ash billowed from the summit. It made no sense. Adari helped Isri to his feet. That's a granite peak, she said over the subsiding echo. It's not a volcanic. It is now. And that's the end of that chapter. And it looks like the next one is about the same length as what I just read, so we'll go ahead and just read it. How long have we been going? Yeah, 28 minutes. We're good. A rock was a simple thing, but as her grandfather had told her, by simple things we know the world. Adari had never felt shame for all those hours she spent searching the creek beds, or for finding more of interest in the shards of a shattered stone than in her children's first words. She was teaching them, but the rock was teaching her. Now, thanks to a simple rock, she was seeing more of the world than ever before. From high above, clinging to the broad back of Nink, it was an unlikely position for either of them, but she'd been in it for most of the night and part of a day. Her first Uvak flight. It wasn't by choice. The hours after the explosion on the mountain hadn't gone that badly, she thought. Audience members at the hearing had fled to their homes. She'd done the same after Daj and his cohorts left together, quibbling over signs and portents. By the next morning, however, the mood of the town had changed. The faraway Katajan peak was still smoking, but it had become clear that it posed no danger to Tav or the villages farther down the watershed. It was safe for everyone to go outside, out to Adari's front yard, to express their feelings about her faithless words and the smoldering addition to the skyline that they had caused. The Skyborn did listen. What other proof was needed? If the Kashiri couldn't silence Adari Val, they'd at least make sure their voices were louder than hers. They'd been doing a good job of it when Adari sent Yulin and the kids out to take refuge at her uncle's place. The growing crowd, still pelting the house with rocks, had parted to let the innocents leave, but the mob had stayed straight through the afternoon rain, and by sunset the Neshtavar themselves were outside, their Uvak tethered safely away from the throng. By the time Isri Daj had hobbled up the steps to pound on her door, Adari had seen the first torches lit outside. That had been enough for her. The torches could have been for light, but they might have been for something worse. She'd clearly exceeded whatever protection a widow of an Uvak rider was afforded. The Kashiri weren't big on violence, but they didn't have a lot of variety in their social sanctions either. Judging that it didn't look like a banishing kind of crowd, Adari had turned in desperation to her own backyard and that least liked portion of her legacy, Nink. Her departure over the rooftop had surprised the people out front almost as much as the maneuvers success had surprised her. The Uvak was most surprised of all. With his rider gone, Nink could have expected never to be ridden again. Uvak took to new riders so seldom that they were promptly put out to stud. Awakening to Adari trying to clamber aboard his fleshy back, Nink could have done anything, gone anywhere. He went up. She had spent the rest of that night alternately screaming and dodging pursuit by Neshtavar flyers. The latter feat was made easier by Nink's insistence on soaring far out over the ocean. Those had been the worst. The worst moments for Adari, who knew the animal's past. But something on the Uvak's part, perhaps curiosity, kept him from sending her to Jari's grave. Just before dawn, Nink had finally found a seaside mountain roost, where Adari immediately collapsed with exhaustion. Amazingly, when she woke, the Uvak was still there, stuffing his beak with little foliage there was. Home clearly wasn't looking that attractive to Nink anymore. Either. Now, on the second morning since the explosion, Adari saw that her directionless night flight had taken her near the source of anxiety. Excuse me. The Cetagian range. We'll say Cetagian. The Cetagian range was a chain of craggy Goliaths slivered from the mainland, a prominent part of the horizon when seen from the interior, but as inaccessible as places on the western shoreline got. An expedition of rock hunters had brought back what little Adari knew of the place, and that had required a sympathetic volunteer Neshtavari willing to fly a sample return mission. Seeing the mountain ahead of her, Adari was overtaken by the urge to see the truth up close. If the explosion wasn't volcanic, it could set things right with her and the community. And if the mountain... Man, got the yawns all of a sudden, sorry. And if the mountain was suddenly volcanic, she was curious about that too. What was the process involved? Or were the scholars wrong about the makeup of the range? Had the Uvak writer flubbed the sample? That was probably it. Adari's anger rose as Nink did. The Uvak comfortably clearing the chain in preparation for an oceanside approach. It would be poetic, Adari thought, if the one project the scholars had entrusted to a Neshtavar had resulted in wrong information. Cetagian range samples nothing, she thought. The idiot probably brought us rocks from his front path. She shuddered, and not just from the chilly air. Why should she be made to suffer for their colossal... Suddenly the source of the smoke column came into view. Adari nearly fell off Nink right then. She'd half expected to see an open caldera steaming like the smokers. Smoke really was a misnomer she'd seen in the south. Instead, a massive shining shell sat in an indentation on the seaward side of the mountain. That was the word that entered her mind, even if the scale was completely wrong. Its sharp corrugated ridges resembled the ancient conches she'd seen returned from the seabed, but this shell was the size of the Circle Eternal, and this shell had smoke, not steam, billowing from several ruptures. Tremendous grooves gouged behind the body showed it had struck down at an angle. The fires inside were now nearly spent, but she could tell from the melted mangle that they must have been far larger once. The explosion producing the plume visible from the inland side must have happened right when it landed, she thought. Landed? Before Adari could contemplate this, movement caught her eye. One of the apertures in the shell disgorged something that struck the gravel below and disappeared in a slide of dust. She nudged the Uvak nearer. A flash of crimson light appeared in the small cloud, and at its end, a man. The man looked up at her. He was pale of face, lighter than the sickest Kashiri she had ever seen, and in his left hand was a shaft of brilliant red light the size of Isri's cane. Was it in his hand, or was it part of his hand? Adari panicked, and Nink agreed, swooping out of the way. A violent but welcome updraft yanked them both back out over the sea. Adari shook her head violently and closed her eyes as Nink found smoother air. What had she seen? It had the shape of a man, yes, hair darker than any Kashiri, but then that red light. What was that light? And there was something else moving on the mountain, too. Something she'd seen out of the corner of her eye. Was the shell a nest of some kind? She swallowed hard, her throat raw from the wind and elevation. It was all too macabre. Sample return missions, Neshtavar inquests, none of her past concerns stood for anything against what she'd seen. Opening her eyes, she brought Nink around on a looping approach, parallel to the jagged beach. The giant shell perched near the end of the sheer drop-off far above. She'd approached from below, this time rising carefully until she could get a closer look. Adari soon realized that her plan, while reasonable, was wholly unsuited for a novice rider. Nink strained against her, taking her on a spiraling route to the top that wrenched her stomach. Dizzy, she fought to keep her eye on the cliff top. The figure from before was there, without the bright red light, but holding something else. Something whizzed past, hurtling downward at such speed that Nink withdrew his wings in fear. Adari slipped for real this time, tumbling backward. Flailing, she caught the Uvok's clawed foot with one arm on the way down and desperately wrapped her other arm around it. Nink! She strained to look up, but Nink was on the move, sailing away from the crest and its strange goings-on, as fast as his reptile wings could carry him. Dangling, she saw that Nink was making for the safety of their earlier roost, farther up the chain. He'd obviously had enough surprises for one day. She had too, but at least she was getting used to them. Or so she thought. Okay. Shortly before the sun slipped behind the western ocean, she watched the last wisps of smoke disappear from the mountaintop. Adari didn't think Nink could be coaxed up there again before her water pouch ran out. The dried brecca beets were already gone. She'd left so quickly she hadn't restocked her expedition pack. Now, sitting on the ledge and watching the sunset, she drew an invisible continent on her knee, wondering how far she would have to fly to reach any settlement that had not heard of her plight. There probably wasn't such a place. The Neshtavar weren't just the peacekeepers and lawgivers. They were the communication system that made far-flung Kesh one world. Circuit riders would have already spread the word from Tav to the elder riders in each village. She had escaped, but freedom was no deliverance for her. Deliverance. The word reached her on the wind. It wasn't even a word, really, not one she had heard before. A strange melodic combination of syllables that meant nothing to her ear, yet her mind recognized it as a familiar concept, deliverance. Instinctively, she looked back toward the mysterious peak drowning in shadow. Lights winked in the darkness near its massive base. Fires, but not the uncontrolled fires that must have been present at the mountaintop. These fires had been set. Adari sprang to her feet, losing her water pouch over the edge. The Neshtavar. They'd hunted her here, and they'd camped, and in the morning they'd find her. They wouldn't wait to find out what she'd seen atop the mountain, not when she'd compounded her crime by daring to fly Nink. A breeze was blowing to the sea from the direction of the mountain. Cool, calming. Deliverance, came the word again. Another feeling followed, complex and emphatic. We are yours and you are ours. Adari blinked back bewildered tears and stepped toward the sleeping Uvok. The wind rose again. Come to us. She'd been wrong to come here. The sky had told her to, but it didn't seem like any kind of deliverance Adari knew. Her nose crinkled at the stench. The gully was dark, but it was clear something awful had been burned there. Even the sulphurous pits of the south weren't this bad. She looked back at Nink, yawning in the woods and unwilling to follow her further. Wise animal. The active fires were ahead. Oh, so she must have gone there. Okay. The active fires were ahead, through trees over the hill. Air caressed her as she crept up. Whatever they were burning, it wasn't what was in the gully. In the clearing below, Adari saw them. People. As many people as had been at her final hearing, only gathered around multiple campfires. She again thought of the Neshtavar lying in wait for her. If so, then her arriving on foot was probably for the best. She strained to make out their voices as she approached. She recognized one, but not his words. She crept closer and left her feet entirely, hurtling toward a tree. Flailing, Adari slammed hard against it, collapsing breathlessly at its base. Figures rushed at her from the shadows. Scrambling, she saw them, their bodies illuminated not by the fires, but from stalks of magenta energy emanating from their hands, just like she had seen before. She tripped over a root. No! She never hit the ground. An unseen force yanked her through the maze of figures, depositing her abruptly before the largest bonfire. Rising, her back to the flames, she looked at the advancing wraiths. They were people, but not like her. Not purple, but beige, brown, red, and more. Every color but what they were supposed to be, and some faces weren't like hers at all. Tiny tentacles wiggled on red jowls. A fat, leprous figure, twice as bulky as the rest, and with a hide like Nink's, stood behind them all, grunting gutturally. Adari screamed, but they weren't listening. They were all around her now, man, woman, and monster, shouting gibberish. She mashed her hands to her ears. It did no good. The words were digging past her ears, digging at her mind. Mental pinpricks became knives. Adari reeled. The stranger surged forward physically and ethereally, pushing, scraping, searching. Waves of images flashed before her, of her sons, her house, her people, everything that was Adari, everything that was Kesh. She still saw mouths moving, but the cacophony now boomed inside her head. Words meaningless. No, words, meaningless words, that somehow began connecting with familiar impressions, as with the breeze before the voices were alien, but she could feel the sounds coalescing around rational thoughts. You are here. There are others. There are others. Bring them here. Take us there. Bring them here. Adari spun, or all of Kesh did. Above her, the group parted for a new arrival. It was a woman, darker skinned than the others. She held a baby tightly swaddled in a red cloth. Mother, Adari thought, against the clamorous assault. A sign of hope, mercy. Bring them here, bring them here, bring them here. Adari screamed, writhing against the unseen claws raking at her. The others were holding back. The woman above. Oh, the woman above was not. Adari reeled. She thought she saw the veined wings of Nink flying overhead and away. A hand appeared on the mother's shoulder from behind, drawing her back. The din faded from Adari's mind. She looked up to see Jarival. No, she realized as her teary eyes focused. Another of the strangely clad figures, but short and stocky like her husband. She had once imagined Jari at the bottom of the sea, his rich mauve color drained. This man was paler still, but his dark shock of hair and reddish-brown eyes gave him a confident, compelling look. She had seen him before on the mountain. She had heard him before on the wind. Corson, he said, simultaneously, in her mind and with a voice as soothing as her grandfather's. He gestured to himself. I am called Corson. Blackness closed around her. And that is the end of chapter 2. And we're at 46 minutes. I think that's pretty good for this reading session. Besides, I'm getting the yawns, which I know is always a sign that I'm not breathing enough while I read, and I'm getting droopy. So I'm going to call it there. There are only 2 more chapters, so that works out. We'll finish it up on Monday and move on to the next in this series. There's a whole series of short books, I should say. We have a couple, I think, a couple comics coming up after Skyborn, just 2 issues. That goes back to the Fall of the Sith Empire comic series. And finishes that up, I believe. And then we're on into the rest of the Lost Tribe of the Sith, which is 2 more books. Yeah, 2 more books. And then we get back into some other comics again, I think. So, yeah. So, we'll finish this up on Monday, and I will see you then. Well, for this, I'll see you then. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow night for some Hogwarts Legacy. I'm going to go ahead and raid somebody since I haven't been raiding lately. Atomic Heart. I have not seen that yet. Glock 316 is playing that. Let's go over and check it out. Oh, Quincy's Tavern is doing some Sons of the Forest. I don't know what that is. But he's got a lot of viewers. He doesn't need us. Let's go to somebody smaller. We'll go to Glock. See what this Atomic Heart looks like. And I will see you over there.
Thank you so much for the raid. How's everybody doing? For everybody, oops, hold on, I got a bad guy. There we go. Thank you so much for the first time chat. How you doing, man? I appreciate you coming through. Right now we're playing Atomic Heart.